She's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie, the Riveter.
Rosie the Riveters were so vital to the war effort, they even had a song written about them. Over 16 million American men and women served in our armed forces in World War II, and as men were called up, women took their places on the production line. Women who, prior to the war, had not been allowed on the factory floor, stepped up and made the most of their opportunities. They proved that they were just as capable of learning and working as their male counterparts.
Rosie, 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 working on assembly line.
These women were just 3 of the 19 million females in the labor force at the height of World War II. Over the 4 years of the war, they helped America double its industrial output. In their later years, they liked to relate stories of patriotism, air dogs, Corsairs, rivet guns, shoes, pants, coveralls, and movie stars.
Rosie, the Riveter.
These trained men have been in great demand by the armed forces. As a result, vast inroads have been made on male personnel available for the production of essential war materials. Such production must be kept at its peak. It is the foundation on which the Allies must build the offense which will bring us victory. The manpower shortage is being solved by training women to do almost the entire job. Waitresses, sales girls, housewives, all have willingly taken their places in national defense.
6 months before Pearl Harbor, only 60 people worked in the Goodyear Air Dock in Akron, Ohio. It was one of the largest structures in America at the time. Yet, just 2 years later, a factory that had 7 times the floor space had been built right next to it. 30,000 people were employed within its walls.
The structural steel workers held a little celebration as the last girder went into place. More buildings went up to make other plane parts and completed planes and dirigibles for the Navy.
Akron, mainly known for the production of tires and lighter-than-air craft, started producing many other war-related items, one of which was an airplane called the Corsair. Its distinctive folding wings were designed to take up less space on aircraft carriers. Goodyear delivered 4,006 of these airplanes during the war. About 40% of the workers on the Corsair production line were women. They earned the nickname Rosie the Riveter because they literally riveted the planes together. There was a mass migration to Ohio, mostly from Appalachia, as factories geared up production. Over the war years, Ohio's population grew by 500,000 people. 3 of the women who came to Akron to join the workforce were Edith White Franks. They affectionately called her Whitey, like her maiden name, and she was from South Charleston, West Virginia. Helen Farley Argenio, often referred to as Spider Eye due to her knack of discovering vintage jewelry. She was barely out of high school and hailed from East Liverpool, Ohio. And Oma Kline Porter, small of stature but big in self-confidence. Her nickname was Legs. She traveled from Steubenville, Ohio. The scramble was on to recruit women to work in Fortress America. To accomplish this, since industry was male territory and a woman was expected to be a homemaker, the War Department felt the need to produce a pamphlet explaining how to hire, train, and utilize women workers. Female employment in defense industries grew by 462% from 1940 to 1944.
They had people out canvassing for workers because they were desperate for workers. The boys had gone to service, and so they ran into me because I was at the thing for young people to learn trades at South Charleston. And so they ran on to me, and next morning I was, after I talked to my mom and dad, next morning I was on a bus coming to Akron.
Well, my parents brought me here from East Liverpool with the intentions of me finding a job, and it was on Saturday. But all the businesses were open, and the employment agency was open, which was in the ACNY building on East Exchange Street, right off Main. And I went there, and they gave me a test, a very small test, and said, you can go to work Monday. But I had to have a vaccination, So we went down the street to a doctor's office and I got vaccinated and had no extra clothes with me at all. We expected to go back home the same day. So we went down the street to a department store and bought me some clothes. And when my parents went back home, they shipped me some.
It may have been a giant step forward for the expanding role of women in American society, but it was still a male-dominated world.
Head of the flight test division, and he interviewed me and wanted to know how good a typist I was and whether or not I could take dictation and all that sort of thing. So then he had me walk up these steps, walk across the platform, and I had to stretch real high because I was kind of short, and even with 3-inch heels is what I wore then. Yeah, I had to stretch real high to write this information. I came down and he said, "You have the job." And he said, "Frankly, I was going to give you the job if you could type 10 words a minute because everybody else that applied had legs like stumps." And he says, "Yours were good to look at." Well, I wasn't offended because they called me legs. I mean, I was real thin. I was about 95 pounds and 5'3", and I wasn't offended that he would comment on my legs.
The testing they took as they applied for a job led them to specialized schools, training that got them ready to work in the war effort.
Would you like to work in a factory?
I don't know anything about machines.
Can you drive a car? Ride a bicycle? Can you replace a burnt-out fuse?
Oh, yes, I can do that.
Then you can be trained for a job, and the training won't cost you a cent.
Even the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, made a pitch for training women to enter the workforce.
At the present time, it is of paramount importance that the women and girls of our country be given training so that they may do their share in the war emergency. How this training is given and who does it is of great interest to us all.
I went to college with the pilots and learned navigation and fundamentals of flight and how to read the Morse code.
They sent me to school then to learn how to do what I was supposed to do. And they gave us a rivet gun and an electric drill and said start. And we had metal that we riveted together and drilled holes and learned how to countersink. I was there for about 3 weeks, and then I was transferred to Goodyear Hall for more schooling, and then out to Plant D.
The steel workers had no more than moved out than crowds of new employees began to gather at the gates.
They were hiring all these people, and there still wasn't room for them to work. Plant D was being built at the time, and actually when I went out there, there was the end of the building was not finished. It had a canvas curtain there, and it was in the winter, cold weather. We had to wear coats.
Restaurants and hospitals, parking lots and cigarette machines went in, and in no time there were thousands of people working. Akron quickly got used to the novelty of girls in industry. Girls fresh out of high school and young wives whose menfolk are overseas donned slacks and learned to handle a riveting gun and a welding torch. Housewives with sons in the Army gave their boys wholehearted support at home, helping to build the equipment they needed to win battles. Now, cable splicing, for instance, is a job for nimble fingers.
After one day's instruction, the girl you see here went to work on this Axelson lathe. It's actually only the second day she has been on the job, and yet the foreman in charge says she is doing first rate. The only machine she ever worked before was a sewing machine.
There were big changes in store for a lot of small-town girls. For instance, they were leaving behind their high school fashions to look more like working women.
I had never worn slacks before, and we had to wear slacks to work. or coveralls or something like that.
Some jobs were more suited to the smaller stature of women, like one of Oma's friends.
She worked as an electrician and wired the insides of the planes, tips, up in the wings. She was 4'10" and just about as big as a minute. And I used to zip her up in the morning in her coveralls because she was buxom. That was the only real large part about her. And I'd zip her up in her coveralls so she could wiggle up into these planes.
While riveting metal to metal was the job that led to the Rosie's nickname, women also worked on every other component in a Corsair.
Small assembly, what they called sub-assembly. It was taking raw parts and doing the very first assembly of those parts, and that was on the part of the plane that is the mechanism to raise the wings.
Women were involved in the manufacturing process from the beginning to end. They worked on the factory floor, of course, but they also held down very responsible office jobs.
I worked in the flight test division, and I had to record all the flights and the airplanes that were to be tested, keep track of all the pilots. I had to record everything. See, I wrote who was flying and the time of takeoff and landing, where they were going, and what pilot was assigned to which plane.
The Corsair tries out its wings, folds and unfolds them, for it must operate from carriers where space is at a premium as well as from land bases. And here's the way the ship looks in the air. The pilot pulls up the landing wheels. No stunts on this flight, a few slow rolls maybe, but this is what the Navy calls the shakedown flight, merely to see that all parts and controls are working smoothly. Steve stays up half an hour, then signals the control tower he's ready to come in. Swings easily earthward through the clouds. The plane comes to a stop quickly. It is designed to do it flat tops and on improvised runways in the jungle. Steve swings back to the starting point, signals the ground crew okay.
Occasionally, something would go wrong on a test flight, like the one where a Corsair destined for the British Air Force had to do a belly landing. All the pilots were Oma's friends, so it was a heart-pounding time when a crash occurred, but it was her responsibility to spread the word.
I had to call Harry Bly, P.W. Litchfield, and all the big ones over there, and then I would go be sick because I'd be so upset, and then I'd come back and go back to work again.
To meet wartime needs, factories worked 24 hours a day and 7 days a week.
I didn't like first shift because you have to get up too early, and I didn't like midnight shift. I liked second shift all the time. That's when I worked the whole time.
The shifts were 8 and 6.5, and most of the time I worked a 6.5-hour shift. And it was a night shift, and your bonus for working nights was that you got paid 8 hours and only had to work 6.5, because they work continuously 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Men and women weren't given equal pay for equal work. Men averaged $54 a week, while women averaged only $34.
The main thing I didn't like was the men got paid 15 cents an hour more than the women did. And I worked with a young man, and he worked on one side of that rivet gun, and I worked on the other side, and the next day we switched places. So we did exactly the same job. I was only getting 85 cents an hour. He was getting $1 an hour. And the women weren't allowed to work overtime. He could come in and work Saturdays and Sundays, and I wasn't allowed to. And I wanted to because I wanted the money.
At the beginning of the war, housing was in short supply. Workers had to rent any place they could find a bed. It took a while for the housing market to catch up with the population migration from rural areas to the city. For example, Summit County, Ohio added about 30,000 dwellings during the war. Living on $140 a month when your rent could run $35 a month made for tight budgets. It presented a challenge, but it was possible to find a decent place to live.
If they had a shed in the back, somebody's going to rent that. You know, it would have to be not too shabby or anything like that, but anything that had a bed in it seemed like that they just wasn't any trouble finding a place to rent.
And of course there was the ration books they had to deal with. Everything was rationed, including food, gas, and clothing. It was a daily chore to get the things you needed for everyday living. America had always been a land of abundance, but as soon as the U.S. entered the war, shortages began. It soon became every citizen's duty to cut back so America's military had everything it needed to fight the war.
It's all that ration board's fault. Last week I couldn't even get an extra pair of shoes. The week before it was gasoline. Trying to run our lives for us.
You know, you had to have stamps to buy everything, vegetables and canned goods and meat and shoes and gas, of course. The people who worked in the defense got extra gas coupons because, especially if they lived far away. We had people that drove from Sugar Creek every day, places like New Philadelphia. But we had ration stamps for everything. In fact, the shoes was a big problem for me because you only got 2 ration stamps a year. That's all the shoes you could buy. But my parents didn't use up theirs, so one period my dad would give me his extra one, and the next period my mother would give me hers. So I got a little bit of extra help on the shoes.
Hosiery, you know, they used a hosiery nylon to make parachutes. And so hose was just impossible to get. And not many women was wearing them anyhow, but you couldn't find any, you couldn't buy any at all.
To provide their own fruits and vegetables, U.S. citizens planted victory gardens. Nearly 20 million gardens were planted in backyards, empty lots, and even city rooftops. It was estimated these gardens provided 9 to 10 million tons of produce each year, an amount that equaled the commercial production in the United States.
I got along okay with the food because my parents lived on, well, it wasn't exactly a farm, but they had 10 acres, and so they would, if I was short, they'd send me something.
Meanwhile, back on the war front, Corsairs flew 60,000 sorties. Pilots often visited the factory to offer encouragement. Quite often, they told hair-raising stories about the 1,600 planes the workers had built but were lost in the war. Their visits were grim reminders that the people in the military were putting their lives on the line for the safety of the home front.
Occasionally, they would have, when somebody would come in, some high officer in the service would come in and they would tell us stories about what they had done and about how many planes that were shot down or ditched. So it's no wonder we still had to keep making more and more of them because a lot of them were shot down.
In their off hours, the Rosies learned to entertain themselves, taking up hobbies and playing together to keep up their morale.
Stores and markets were persuaded to stay open evenings. Hairdressers, dances, movies, sports were more and more made available at the unaccustomed hours required by the hidden army.
Things were open all around the clock pretty much because we had people working around the clock. We'd get off work at 6 o'clock in the morning and go bowling down at Goodyear Hall. And they didn't have automatic pin setters then. And usually weren't any there, so we had to set our own pins. But we had a lot of fun.
Ice skating and roller skating was my 2 hobbies during the war. I bought me skates and I learned to do both real well.
Morale was also boosted by visits from movie stars and other celebrities.
Irene Dunn, Ronald Colman, Hedy Lamarr, Greer Garson, all part of a contingent of some 50 screen celebrities giving their time and talents to aid the national war effort.
I know one time Wallace Berry visited the plant, and everybody was real enthused to see him because he was a famous movie star at the time, and he came and spent some time out in the plant and all.
There were very few opportunities for women to fly in the airplanes they built, but at least one Rosie snuck into forbidden territory.
I got to go for an airplane ride. I even got to go for an airplane ride in a Corsair, because at that time I was a tiny little thing, and I could sit between his knees, and we went for a little ride, and he brought me back and hoped nobody saw us, and I guess they didn't, because we got away with it.
The biggest morale boost came on August 14, 1945, when the war finally ended.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of land.
The greatest news story of all time, final unconditional surrender, with the whole world waiting to celebrate. In every town and hamlet across the nation, the story was the same.
It was on a Thursday night, about 7 o'clock, because I remember we threw down our drills and our bucking bars and everything we was working with, because we was at work, second shift, and we threw everything, grabbed our purses, and we went, and it was just mad. And there was no alcohol or drugs or anything at that time, positively none. But it was just happy people, happy that the war had ended. Just danced and hollered and whooped, and just like the idiots. They just like, they was happy. You know, I was one of them. You know, I was one of them. I was a happy idiot too. But everybody was so happy because everybody had somebody in it. And now they get to come home.
The Rosies of World War II contributed to the fight for women's equality, but at the time they had more personal reasons for fighting the war from the home front.
Why did I take a defense job? That's a funny question. I never thought of that before. Do you have to have a reason? We're in a jam, aren't we? I'm sorry, but you'll have to excuse me. I'm too busy to answer damn fool questions like that.
I have 2 sons in the Army. Now, I'm in the Army, too, in a way.
I wanted to bring my dad home sooner. He's in Greenland.
Because my husband's in the Navy, and I want to do a job that means more than working in a department store.
I like to do everything I did, and I did it well. That's what makes it fun and makes it a success and brings the boys home. That was our goal. Everybody seemed to want to, they either had a husband or a son, you know, in the war, and I had 2 brothers in the war, and they came home.
Over 70 years later, the air dock still stands, and it gained National Historic Landmark status in 1973. The factory buildings constructed during World War II have been joined by more modern facilities. Of the 12,571 Corsairs built, only about 30 are still flying, and another 50 are either on display or being restored. The Rosies? Well, just like the returning soldiers, they got on with their lives. Edith Franks married, had 4 children, and worked as a home health care provider. She liked to tell the story of the time she rode the bus from West Virginia to Akron and how she learned to use a rivet gun and bucking bar. Helen Argenio married and had 2 children and worked for the post office. Occasionally she would tell her kids about when she was young and how she left her small town to live in the big city. Oma Porter married and had 1 child and did secretarial work in Canton, Ohio. She liked to reminisce about airplane rides and the pilots that were her friends. And all 3 women were very proud they had gone to work to help win a war.
Don't All the day long, whether rain or shine, she's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie, the riveter, keeps a sharp lookout for sabotage, sitting up there on the fuselage. That little frail can do more than a male can do. Rosie, the riveter. Rosie's got a boyfriend, Charlie. Charlie, he's a Marine. Rosie is protecting Charlie, working overtime on the riveting machine. When they gave her a production knee, she was as proud as a girl could be. There's something true about red, white, and blue about Rosie, the riveter. Rosie, the riveter. Rosie, 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 working on assembly line. Bubble day, bubble dee, leave it on that day.
Lesson plans and other educational resources for the women who helped win a war are available online at mapsairmuseum.org.
Rosie, 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 the riveter, on the assembly line.